Good morning. We're in our third Latin American seminar on food, environments, and health. And this roundtable that I have the huge pleasure to chair is on food systems and food environments and sustainability. I'm Vanessa Schottz. I'm a professor at the Institute of Food and Nutrition at the Federal University in Mackay and the Graduate Studies program in Food and Nutritional Security. And I wish to thank you for the opportunity to be here chairing this seminar, which is a milestone. We're in the third seminar in this series, and we have more than 800 people now that are online who participated in the opening session and are going to be with us in this roundtable. It's a huge joy to be able to share this meeting with these three women who are professors and researchers with whom their references in research on these themes. And they're also people that are activists who work as well in the struggle for the human right to adequate food and nutritional security.
Here with Cecília Rocha, with Suzi, with Cavalli, with Elder, our friends, and we will have the following dynamics. Each speaker will speak around 25 minutes, and after our three speakers, we will have a Q&A session for questions, so you can interact with our chat as soon as we finish our presentations, and then in the debate, we will start with our comments and questions from each one of you. And then to start, I would like to invite our dear Cecília Rocha that will talk about inequalities in the food system. She's a staff member at the Ryerson University in Canada and a researcher from the Study Center in Food Safety. So we have different associations with different reference centers in nutrition and food safety, and I'm part of these networks. And Cecilia is a member of the International Panel of Sustainable Food Systems, EPIS Food, since 2014, and she's the main writer of one report on food health nexus. So Cecilia is a great reference in this debate of food safety and food environment. Cecilia, what an honor to have you. It's a pity we're so far away. We're still waiting for your visit here in Brazil to give you a hug and meet again. Yes, Vanessa, I am the one that thanks you the invitation and the opportunity to be this morning here. And really, we have a list with outstanding items when the pandemic is over, to be together with our friends and hug everyone. But for the moment, we have to still um, meet virtually. I will share my screen. And I would like to thank the invitation for the topic that was assigned for my presentation to talk about inequalities in food systems. And thinking about which could be the topics of my presentation, I took a look at the agenda and the topics and focused on the role of research to talk about figures and inequalities in food systems, and some thoughts on the role of research in these issues, not only in everything that has to do with inequalities, but in general. Because actually, when we talk about inequalities in food systems in Latin America, it is a very painful task, especially if we talk about the situation here in Brazil and the recent situation here in Brazil. We know that inequality has increased, not only when we talk about inequality amongst countries, we know that, as a consequence of the pandemic, there has been a exposure of these inequalities. And apart from the inequality among countries, within country inequalities, I will not talk, as I said, about hard figures, and I will account for this further on. But for us, for all of you who are very much aware of the situation here in Brazil, when we take a look at the pictures we have of people trying to get food from garbage trucks, it is a very painful picture filled with despair. But inequalities are not only related to these images and these persons in such a difficult situation. We have to think about the fact that the number of Brazilian billionaires has increased. So the list of wealthy, extremely rich billionaires in Brazil has increased. So this is the tragedy of inequality, because the poles, the inequalities, the extremes have grown further apart. We know that extreme poverty is also based in the skin color, gender. There are nuances that are taken into account, and all play a role in malnutrition and food security. The comments I want to make, not 25 minutes, just some food for thought. There are two other fantastic researchers, and I would like to listen to their comments. What I would like to share with you is what to do with the current situation, especially from the perspective of a researcher like us. So the first thing we need to do is to recognize which is the nature of the problem, to know what we're talking about, which are the characteristics of inequality, not only in general terms, but also in specific terms, region-specific, country-specific terms, to identify which are the groups that are most affected by inequality as a larger problem. But we need to recognize that inequality is related to power inequalities, not only within the food system, but also as a greater and larger problem in distribution and economic systems. Food distribution systems, availability of food, and power inequality that lies beyond these issues, trying to identify solution possibilities. So this is what I wanted to share with you this morning, and I apologize for those that, of course, are very much familiarized with these issues and questions. For me, I must admit that the inequality issue is a topic I'm focusing on for some time, and I would like to share some basic concepts that help me to think about the nature of inequality. I apologize because some of my slides are written in English, because I used my slides for other presentations. I'm here at Ryerson University, so I apologize for that too. But before I start sharing my presentation, I would also like to say that one of the main topics that we have to deal with in Canada, and since the topic is inequality, I would like to pay tribute to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, especially the indigenous peoples where I'm at here in Toronto. I am here in their territory. Canada, and Toronto specifically, is going through a reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples. And if you have received my mails with my signature, we will change the name of our university that is called Ryerson University, because Ryerson was a tribute to a person that established the education system here in the province of Ontario. But the thing is that recently we have discovered that this person was responsible for the system implemented in the Indigenous people's schools. And maybe you have watched or seen the discoveries of anonymous graves in the schools' yards. So we're currently going through a very painful process here in Canada of recognition, admitting facts, and reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples, and trying to value our historical heritage in the Americas, not only related to the Indigenous past, but slavery as well. And the heritage of our history is an essential topic. So I would like to pay homage to the territory where I'm at in this new reconciliation approach of with the Indigenous peoples in Canada and the Americas. So what have I tried to focus on when I think about the topic of inequality, and especially which is the role of research? You have seen this drawing that explains the difference between equality and equity. It took me a very long time to understand the difference between equality and equity, and this drawing really helped me. It was great. On the one hand, we have the representation of what could be a representation of equality. So there are three persons that are trying to watch a baseball game. And sometimes we think about equality as the distribution of resources in the same manner. So the resources are the boxes. Look at these boxes. We have equal boxes, and we are an egalitarian society. We distribute resources in an egalitarian manner, one box for each person. But this idea of equality is what has triggered the confusion of merit issues. That is, if everybody is receiving the same box, the result, the different results we obtain are everyone's responsibility. If you deserve better, you will have better, because everybody received the same resources, everybody received the same box. And what shed light on this concept was the drawing. And see that resource distribution needs to be done in a different way to get fair results. If we want these three persons to watch the game, we need to distribute resources in a different manner. And this is a very difficult issue, a very difficult topic to explain in political terms. But the more understand the difference between equality and equity, the better will be our possibilities to make progress and do what needs to be done. So this is the first concept or the first idea I would like to share with researchers. We're not talking about equality. We're talking about equity. We need to focus on the results. And in order to have equity in our results, we need to distribute resources in a different manner, because some do not need a resource. That is, they do not need the box to watch the game. Some need some resources and some need more resources. That is what equity is about. But we need to evolve in the idea of resource distribution. And this drawing also explains the difference between equity and equality, because even though we want to distribute resources in a manner that favors equity, some resources are not appropriate. So that is why we need to take a look at the nuances in inequalities and look at how this picture highlights the importance of inclusion. Which are the resources we need to allocate to overcome inequality? So take a look at these boxes. These boxes are not the best resources for all. We need to transform some resources in these more accessible possibilities for those that have any type of disability. So a box will not do for anyone that needs a special attention. So we have focused on distribution of resources, but which resources? We will distribute different resources for different people, but which resources and how can we adapt these resources? But ultimately, what we want is to reach this last image. What we do need is to eliminate barriers. That is what we need to do. So in terms of equity and social justice, we're not only talking about resource distribution. Sometimes, yes, there is a fence that can't be taken down, but sometimes we need to think differently. And to think differently, we need to take a look at things from a different perspective. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with food systems, but has to do with classrooms, with teaching. And this reflection was a consequence of the pandemic and has to do with access. We have better access before the pandemic because of what we needed to do, what we had to consider and overcome the barrier that prevented people from watching the game. No matter how you are, it is very important to think about this.
The idea of researchers and inequality and equity in food systems involves all of this documenting, recording the nature of these inequalities, but also it involves conceiving and reflecting on how to have public policies or how to avoid the issue of inequalities, if it's an issue of distribution of resources, or if you actually want to change the entire system to have access to for everyone. Unfortunately, nevertheless, we have the reality, which is the reality of resources which are not appropriate. They're not distributed appropriately or fairly. The resources which are not equal for all, and once again, it can be distributed in a fair way, but we have this reality on the right-hand side, which is what we see with inequality increasing, and we have more resources for some people, and other people have had their resources eliminated, not only not having resources, but there are people or groups who are prevented from accessing the increasing inequalities involves this situation illustrated in the picture. So I want to role of research and researchers in some, especially in the document that we developed with IPIS Food on this issue of the relationship between food systems and health. We propose this idea of increasing research for the public good, which is a concern which I believe we have worldwide, but especially here in North America. It has been a trend, a worrisome trend, which is privatization of research. Why is this something that bothers me and which keeps me busy reflecting on it? First of all, because what we need is when we're talking about documenting or recording inequities and making inequities visible, it is because we haven't even attempted and don't have sufficient data on inequalities concerning the characteristics of people and groups who suffer this inequality. So, for example, if in global terms, to attempt to have data, to obtain data on people who are affected in their workplaces, like poisoning from pesticides, for example. Where are the data on this? Of course, in North America, you have data, but there are few people who suffer these problems. So the first measure by researchers is to make these issues visible, to make these inequalities visible and characterized, focusing on the characteristics of different groups who are suffering in this issue of inequality, this situation of inequality. But in addition to that, it's to question how we have increasingly had studies being privatized, increasingly research as a public without sufficient support. Why is this important? Because we know that at the base of this inequality, there is a difference in power, economic and political power. So if this research is not for the public good, the way that they're structured, the questions that are addressed, the problems that are prioritized, and how the data are collected, and from which groups and who has access to these data. All of this is increasingly privatized. So I would like here to congratulate and salute the collective who has succeeded in conducting research on food security and insecurity in Brazil. And when we know that the funding for research is being decimated in Brazil, that's the importance of research, I believe. And to conclude, I would like to state here this idea of the importance and why this research is important, because we need policies on inequality. So here we connected a Venn diagram about how policies that we want them to be based on knowledge-based and research-based policies. But in reality, we have to acknowledge that there's this conflict between public health interests and industry interests here. So we have the concerns in public health and the interest of the food industry. In order for issues to become policies, public policies, they are involved in this conflict. So I think that the role of researchers is to bring subjects the issue in this case of invisibility and to discuss visibility in public health concerns, have this as a public health issue, and as we accumulate knowledge and research on this topic, there's going to be a clash with industry, as we have now on many topics, a clash with industry, which is in this area here. What we want is for this to move and shift to area number one, for it to become a public policies, but this is going to depend on who wins in the clash. It could be that it may be the industry that will win in the clash. Policies that are not appropriate, in other words, to decrease this inequality. So this is what I see as the role of researchers, influencing not only lending visibility to these issues as public health issues, but also giving ammunition for these clashes that we're having confrontations with the food industry and the way the system is organized for this to become public policies that are favorable to public health issues. So I'm going to stop here. These are some of the references and the texts that I wrote, which mention some of these issues and reflections that I list here for you. But thank you very much for the opportunity. And if you want to learn more about, I'd like to hear from my other colleagues on the panel, and perhaps we can have a discussion, a longer discussion at the end. Thank you very much for your attention on that. Cecilia, thank you very much indeed. You stuck exactly to your 25 minutes, very punctual, and it's great to hear you, the thoughts, sharing reflections on the role of research in this debate on inequalities to back public policies and the importance of confronting this issue of interest. And it's extremely important because we're now to continue with Elisabetta and Suzi are going to share with us. I believe that this decision that you make is citizens advocacy, research for the public good at the time when we're confronting here in Brazil, drastic cut science and nation. The degree to which this raises an even greater challenge in the context where hunger is increasing in Brazil, and paradoxically, we have even more difficulty in elaborating and producing studies which can give us a panoramic view for funding research in this risk that you discuss, which is imminent to be concentrated with research on private interests to the extent that the funding comes through private channels. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to our dear friend Suzi Cavalli, whom I greatly admire, who's contributed greatly to this debate on food systems and production models. She's going to be talking to us about the issue is food systems, farm and sustainability. And Suzi is a faculty member at the graduate program at the Federal University with various different theses and dissertations that she's supervised. and she's contributed greatly to the debate in this field. She coordinates an observatory on the study on healthy food and sustainable food systems, and participates in the research on nutrition and nutritional agroecology and marketing, food marketing. And Suzi, she was a member of the technical committee on biosafety, CTNB, in the Ministry of Science and Technology from 2011 to 2015. Suzi, it's a huge joy to share the panel with you, and you'll be contributing to the debate. So you have 25 minutes, and I'll let you know when 5 minutes are left. And I know that Cecilia and Elisabetta and others are anxious to hear you. That's great. Vanessa, good morning. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a huge pleasure to be with Vanessa, Cecilia, and Elisabetta in this discussion. And I'm going to share some of our research as well in this theme that we have been working with, after which we can have a discussion there. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Okay, food system, agricultural production, and sustainability. Wonderful, we can see it very clearly. Great. Oh, it's great to hear Cecilia, because I think several different issues and questions, research questions, I believe she gives us an excellent idea for us in this sense of already reflecting on several issues, and also to see that in my talk, there are going to be several issues that we can connect to the issues Cecilia raised. So I want to share here this theme of food system and our agricultural production and sustainability in Brazil, but it's going to be a catharsis. You can see that Cecilia did something more reflexive presentation. And I'm going to raise several issues that we've reflected on in recent years, both in our research and in our concerns in the daily reality in public policies of what we're experiencing. So the first thing is why we have to think of this issue of food systems. We know that food systems are deeply influenced all the way from food production and the issue of the history, culture, and economic trade policies and practices, and economic. And if we ask, what does this have to do with food and nutritional security? What does it have to do with food sovereignty? So if we think that in this food system, in these food systems, we are producing foods which are not safe. They involve some risk to people's health and has to be changed. And when I've been thinking of this and studying this ever since I did my master's at the Rural Extension Service, we studied the organization of agriculture, the breakneck modernization that several different authors recommend as the first green revolution since the 50s. It appeared with this technology and the issue of pesticides, and we can see that it has come as a justification for the issue of hunger and famine and eliminating hunger and food insecurity. That was the proposal of the so-called first green revolution. And very quickly considering that, the second green revolution with transgenics together with pesticides, what do they tell us? We're going to decrease the use of pesticides, they said, so the transgenics would serve this purpose. And they said that they claimed that we're going to decrease hunger. And what we see in nutrition, we continue to have hunger and with food insecurity. And thereby we have a problem of a nutritional transition. And we started to discuss the relationship with the nutritional transition as part of our nutrition issues and questions. The third green revolution with new biotechnologies today, we are discussing other issues, other relations in agriculture production of inputs and foods. And we are discussing also hunger, food insecurity. And today we have in nutrition the process of a syndemic, which is part of the processes and the themes related to the environment. So we can see that these revolutions are extremely interesting for nutrition, not just for us and for health.
So within this global agriculture that is totally industrialized, this was within the industry, the one that faster got better adapted to globalization, that had consequences, very strong consequences in food. And this type of global agriculture has very negative effects for water supply. It uses a lot of water with very terrible soil degradation, environmental consequences, and monoculture specific farming, large scale techniques with soybean, with cotton, sugarcane, and wheat and corn, with different consequences that increase greenhouse gases, specifically related to the negative effects in biodiversity and climate change. So we see that we will not have sustainable development in the 21st century without a radical shift in the way we perform our agricultural practices. We have to shift this, and those uh, academic writers and authors that talk about this topic say that this relationship with water is extremely relevant. 40% of consumption, non-frozen water, use almost 85% of water layers, underwater layers. And when we think about these commodities, we never directly link all of these commodities with water. And of course, we're talking about 24% of the total value of the production of low-income countries is related to that. And what is the relationship of this with our food? Global food, scarce diversity, extremely. We see that our food is based on soybeans and wheat, that is. We're talking about industrialized products. Everything has trans fats, added sugar, and in industrialized products, we have a lot of pesticides. We have very little conventional soybean in Brazil because more than 90% is transgenic, and wheat, it is transgenic, and we import transgenic wheat from Argentina, and our wheat will be transgenic too. So this has a consequence of different chronic diseases, and nutrition as a topic studies all of these negative consequences, and in clinical medicine, how to proceed in the relationship of different diets for diseases. So we see that sustainable diets and food are at risk. This debate should be broadened. We shouldn't talk about food waste. We should overcome this debate if we were serious about this topic, if we really considered these topics in a more serious fashion, talking about the causes. And when we talk about the very fashionable debate on reducing the decrease of food and dairy products, which is totally fashionable and timely. It is a problem, yes, of course, but we need to have a broader vision. We need to focus on all of the processes and everything we eat. It is a difficult question. Yes, of course, it is a difficult question. But of course, we need to focus on the fact that if we professionals, we don't think about the whole picture, who will think about the whole picture if we from the academia don't have such a comprehensive and holistic perspective, who will have it? So this relationship that has to be debated has to do with everything we eat in all of the processes. All of them have problems. So what's the state of the art of these issues? What's the state of the art in Brazil? Of case, FAO-UN considers we are the third country that most uses pesticides. According to IBAMA, we use 620,000 tons of pesticides. And these are absolute figures published by the UN. And they target the relationship between legislation passed due to the possibility of now without pesticide assessment, and we will talk about figures on this, we think that we are ranking first. And as Cecilia mentioned, that is a Brazilian problem. That is our problem. We cannot or we shouldn't think, we from the academia, we shouldn't look for scientific articles that will talk about studies in Europe with pesticide poisoning. No, no, this is our problem. It's a Brazilian problem. So these issues are very, very serious. So when IBAMA says that out of these, almost 40% are highly dangerous or almost 60% are dangerous or hazardous, this says something for the type of inspection processes we have. So these are the records for you to take a look, for you to have an idea what has been approved since 2013. You can see all of these approvals that are increasingly flexible. The new approvals are not subject to approvals, neither environmental nor health inspections. And this is our state of the art. And what is going on with this sub-monitoring? Things that haven't been done by Anvisa. There are several negative considerations by different specialists. We cannot compare because the methodology has changed. We're talking about a herbicide that is not included in this assessment. Glyphosate, this is a chemical product that is used in all our farming processes. We have this study that, and this is extremely relevant, that shows that industrialized food still includes molecules of pesticides and water. We have very few cities that monitor water quality. So we fall in the very obvious topics. So pesticides that are absorbed by plants, of course, are not washed away. So contaminated water for consumption, the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation says that there are no safe levels for consumption of water. We're talking about a hypothetical doses. That is, the higher these contents are, the more hazardous it is. We have here in Brazil unauthorized pesticides above limits or prohibited in countries of origin. That's interesting, isn't it? Why industries forbade the use of a pesticide in their country of manufacturing and are authorized here in Brazil? So we're talking about the diseases that are caused by the use of the industry of pesticides. And we, as nutrition specialists, are studying these diseases and we're studying these consequences and links. We have oxidative stress. We have a lot of studies. hypochondrial dysfunction, which is such an important disease. This debate is so timely. Hormonal deregulations. We have related all of this with obesity, genetic and epigenetic data, the relationship between transgenics and pesticides. Of course, there are studies about this and diseases that are relevant in our century, as for instance, different neurological problems, depression, autism, Alzheimer, obesity increase. We have realized that there is an underreporting of these cases, and as Cecilia mentioned earlier, how can we finance studies and surveys to this study, which are the different pesticides, and all of the pesticides that have been authorized have studies that have been funded by the manufacturing companies. There is no one single independent study that supports the use of these pesticides. This study by Raisa Cortesi, she is talking about the relationship between disease and transgenic products. We see that most items analyzed in this very interesting study, she has included many products that are available in supermarkets, and more than 67% of these subgroups of food categories have at least 3 transgenic industrialized food components. So if you read, which is the enforced legislation here in Brazil, these topics are very relevant. And of course, this is the month in which we celebrate Breast Cancer Day. And look at this UniOeste study. The national average is 63, and the relationship between this disease and their relationship, which is a very family farming area, is more than 90. That is 30% more. We're talking about women that are not farmers. They do not work in the farm, but it's a domestic contamination with proximity of fork and knives and different aspects that deal with the relevancy of this topic. So this has to do with family agriculture, and this article talks about the relevancy of this disease in global terms. So this has gained momentum, and this topic was empowered when the United Nations introduced this topic as an interesting possibility for the production of food. We see that 70% of global food production is performed by 70% of land use. In Brazil, food agriculture is extremely important, and we're not talking about the usual format. We're not talking about just families. We're talking about traditional communities and peoples. We talk about fish farmers, extractivists, fishers. That is 70% of total agricultural establishments in Brazil, and they are extremely important in this demographic. And of course, which are the guidelines that are essential? These guidelines should be disclosed: sustainability, food security. This has to be made available for our population. This was published in a book published by Urbis, and our guide is extremely interesting. We talk about the topic about industrialized products and in natura products, and everything that has to do with food production does not include these figures. So everything related to pesticides and transgenic food is not included. This study by Rafaela Fabio, it's her dissertation. It is available at FAO's platform. You see that the recommendations are very relevant. Sustainable environment that deals with topics related to these food production issues. Only 3.2% of guides out of 90 guides published in FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, include these issues. And this has to do with the fact that agriculture needs to be sensitive to nutrition. Vanessa published a pioneering study on this topic, and we stress the fact that food systems should be focused on these topics. Agriculture has to be sensitive to nutrition and not the other way around. We have to say what it is we want to food. Of course, this is an utopia, but utopias push us forward. And that is how we have to talk about agroecology, the theory of trophobiosis, see where our food comes from, as this was described by Anna Maria Primaversi. Where does our food come from? From the soil. Everything that is part of soil is transmitted to our food, and our health comes from the soil, from the balance. Why will we focus on food production? That is where we have nutrients. What is the relationship between nutrition and sustainability? It is just one thing. There's no difference. We also established the concept that we do not need to talk about the concept of health. Health concepts do not only involve nutrition, but involves everything that has to do with production and consumption. And we have focused on these topics, on these methodology issues, and we're talking about these topics from a deeper perspective. And if we talk about macronutrients, organic and conventional nutrients, there is no difference. There is an isonomy. When we talk about micronutrients, research shows difference. And these are essential things in nutrition. It's what we study and we define as the most important things in nutrition. We talk about these micronutrients that are interesting and important for antioxidants, etc. So we have to join specialists like Gleesman and Sachs, and the territory, cultural, and ecology relationship. Everything is one topic that focuses on health, nutrition, and healthy eating. And which are the challenges? Well, we are fighting for ideal labels. In Argentina and in Chile, we have more interesting labels, but we haven't implemented this in Brazil. Look at this strawberry jam. Look at the ingredients. We want everything to be in the label. And if we sell the fruit, we should include which pesticides were used, which were the pesticides used for fresh strawberries, who is the agronomist that's responsible for the produce. So we need to have better labels and include all the information in food labels. And what about biodiversity? We have to focus on these topics. Look about biodiversity. To take a look at biomas and understand biomas and biodiversity in Brazil. Brazil is a fantastic country where many countries within one country. Look at the fruits and the variety we have. Look at these cherries we have in the southern part of Brazil. These foods are free from pesticide. They are not part of the industrialized chains. Look at pomegranate. Look at these very, very Brazilian foods and fruits. These strong berries, such interesting. Why do we import berries? We have our own Brazilian berries. And what about intersector public policies? We have to tax pesticides, tax industrialized food. We should subsidize or make incentives available for the production of organic food. And we have to try to help those farmers that have organic produce. And organic produce needs labels, and regular food regular fruit does not need to be labeled. So this is negative for our organic farmers. So of course, we have to qualify health systems and train professionals that will focus on these issues, label issues, pesticide issues. When a nutritionist studies and they talk about food security, they should study all of these other issues, not only microbiological issues and components, but they should focus on these other issues. And these food guides should focus on recommendations of food security and quality. We should also launch campaigns for sustainable, safe food. We have to focus on food labeling for produce, and we also should focus on the approval of stamps, organic stamps, security stamps, because today, if you're an organic producer, you have to pay this out of your own pocket. So we should focus on legislation and a legal framework that fosters the production of organic and healthy food. We should try to, that is, I believe in the fact that we have to make available the information so that consumers are knowledgeable about everything that they consume. Consumers are the ones that should decide what it is they want to consume, and the consumers should have the possibility to decide what kind of production we want. And when this becomes a reality, we will be able to be the main player in this food system. This is an utopia, I know, but it is a starting point, I believe. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suzi. Right on schedule. Thank you very much. We have some comments here. Leticia is talking about the issue of the cross-cutting issue of sustainability in the food system, which is extremely important. And you gave us this journey all the way from production, labeling, and consumption. And this cross-cutting view, as Leticia is calling attention to, brought us the degree to which it is strategic. And Juliana is commenting here that you gave us important thoughts, that the debate, urgent debate that affects everyone's food, and oftentimes in academia, our training, we have a focus on effective nutrients, single nutrients. And we have been doing, and that it's important for us to include in this debate on food systems. And Erica Louise is just saying that this issue of hormone disruption, we were talking about not only related to the use of pesticides, but also related to the excessive use of plastics. We're going to have an opportunity, and through which we're going to be discussing some of these topics and the questions that have already come in, and some issues here, because both of the talks were very instigating and provocative. We're going to move on to this third thing. Elisabetta Recine, but known as Beta. Elisabetta is her full name, the Observatory on Food and Nutritional Security Observatory at the University of Brasilia, and the issue of nutrition and the Alliance for Adequate and Healthy Food, the working group on food and nutrition systems, public policies and civil society, the Committee on Food Security, the Global Committee on Food Security, and the People's Conference on Food and Nutritional Security and Sovereignty. And we share the work on that committee. It's always a joy and opportunity to learn, to be with you in any place. So now you have 25 minutes to give us your contribution, after which we're going to move on to the dialogue, okay, with people who are attending. Good morning, and thank you very much, Vanessa, Cecilia, Suzi, and everyone who's here. I want to thank you truly for the invitation. I've been monitoring this seminar ever since the beginning. I think it's played an extremely important role of lending visibility to this topic, not only the topic itself, but everything that's being produced in the region. It's essential. And I have a number of questions here, listening to Cecilia and Suzi. And here I'm going to start my stopwatch. Let me know when my time is running out, please. Otherwise, I'll run over my time. I want to share the screen with you. I want to pay tribute here, and my tribute to this highlight that Cecilia did at the beginning of her talk concerning this courageous process in Canada, and wish that we can leave the level of civility, that we'll undergo the same thing here in Brazil. And I'm paying tribute here to all people who actually, the vast majority of the Brazilian people who are experiencing extremely unfair and cruel, unequal, cruel and painful reality, and pay tribute to Brazilian civil society in these two photographs showing here the urban movements. Here it says the homeless people's movement in Sao Paulo when they held a demonstration in the stock exchange of Sao Paulo against hunger. On right, it's the indigenous people's movements, which I think represents today the tip of the iceberg of injustices in the process of annihilation in our reality and our history in Brazil, and the degree to which they are an example in their resistance, and how grateful we should be to all women, children, elders, and adults, and women and men, indigenous people who resist, not only through them, but for all of us, and not only for all of us Brazilians, men and women, Brazil, and for the humankind. They're paying an essential service to humankind. So I want to state this from the onset to begin to talk about this here, the sustainable food systems. And I say this is a big issue because the hegemonic food system, which most countries in the world on the planet Earth, it is a food system, the hegemonic system. It's white, male, exploitative. I think in all the economic systems, the food systems, the hegemonic food system is one of the examples of what Cecilia discussed and problematized so keenly. It's of inequities, not only food injustice, but injustices in general. I'm not going to be talking here about food systems as a whole because they asked me to talk about this core area here, this hard core of the food system, which is this part here, which we call the theme of this meeting, i.e. food environments. I like this depiction here. There are numerous depictions of food systems which attempt to explain the depth and a set of relations and interactions and dimensions of the food system. But I have been working with this scheme here, and I think this one works with the report from 2017 in the expert panel in the Food Security Committee, because it covers the food systems and environments in a broader sense, because it gives greater visibility to this intersection between the issue of food production change related especially to production and some food supply and production and supply, the foods which are part of the people's behavior, food behavior, and the result in terms of food and nutrition leading to results in health and nutrition, but not only that, generating economic results, social and cultural results as well. In this report, which is the report where they talk about the 2030 agenda, they state food environments as the result of these intersections here. And you can look at these results both from the point of view of the individual in a community and a territory and a country, and also the planet. So you have these different layers, and that's what I prepared my presentation for us to talk about this. So it's important, I believe, I'm certain that Suzi addressed the issue of sustainability over the course of all these elements, and I wish to highlight the characteristics, so to speak, of what should be and what we attempt to build on a daily basis, despite the barriers, this paradigm for sustainable food environments. What are the characteristics of sustainable food environments? They should be productive and prosperous. They need to produce sufficient food for all people, and certainly not only in the present, but in the future as well. They need to promote equity and inclusion. So all people that are involved in this process need to enjoy and share the results, the wealth of the foods. They need to be empowering, enabling, and democratic over the course of their process. They need to generate participation, decision-making capacity, legitimate, informed. Of course, they had to be resilient. They need to guarantee stability in situations of emergency and crises. They need to be regenerative. In other words, the process of production needs to generate processes which guarantee future production, and they need, of course, to produce healthy and nutritional food, nourishing our bodies and the planet as well. And looking at these characteristics, we can take a look at the different food systems, all the way from the hegemonic dominant food systems all the way to local food and agroecological food systems, to the degree to which they're closer or farther from these qualities. And zooming in on the issue of food environments, which are the result of this intersection between production and supply chain, the behavior of people. I don't like to talk about consumer behavior. So although you read this here, I'm always going to attempt to remind and talk about food behavior by people, because when of course, there are other references, but I sometimes avoid using the term consumer. Otherwise, we're ruling out more than half of the population in this discussion, and also the issue of the characteristics of the diet. So food environments, they are the result of this intersection between these three major elements. They're going to be consisted of or characterized by the availability and physical access and affordability, acceptability. Which foods are these? The degree to which they're consistent with my habits, values, and my own characteristics, what they have in information orientation guidelines available for that society, in that environment, what is the quality and safety of these foods, and which policy conditions intervene and impact or contribute to or impede all of the previous elements. So therefore, I also like this definition, which says that the food environment is not a situation, a static situation, but a context which links physical, economic, sociocultural, and political aspects, and which shape physical access, affordability, safety, information, and the capacity to analyze information, knowledge, available knowledge, food preferences, and also skills with regard to all of that. And therefore, it links to the food supply chains. And it's interesting constantly to think that this relationship is more than in multidimensional, between behavior and the environment, between chains and environment. So you're constantly needing to think that these relations are dynamic. This gives the wealth of this moment of food environments and the complexity of it as well. Therefore, food environments are one of our critical knots for transformation of food systems, since they're one of the critical nodes or knots. There are proposals that look simply, quote unquote, simply at changes in food environments as protagonists of change in the food systems. And we disagree precisely because we're talking about a topic and a systemic topic which is multidimensional, in which each node alters the other nodes, alter each of the other nodes. We need to constantly think of changes which intervene in the system, ideally as a whole. Of course, this, in real terms, this is extremely complex, but constantly we need to be looking at the specific and the general. The specific and the general for us to be able to move in the transformations that we consider necessary. And it's precisely for that reason that we have some slogans or some rallying cries which move the process of transformation. Eating is an agricultural act, eating is a political act, and food citizenship, the act of eating, is related to what comes before it. The act of eating is an act which relates to transformation of the process as a whole. So I want to take a look at this issue of food behavior, both individual and collective, and everything that's involved around it, and how all of this is the expression of the different food environments. So the issue of what I purchase, how I purchase this, what I am able and can afford to purchase, how I prepare my foods, with whom I consume my food, where I consume it, and how I prepare it, and everything which is oftentimes a challenge, cross-cutting all of this. This wheel is expressing the possibility of eating, but we have to also look at the wheel, which shows the non-possibility or the challenges of eating, because all of this shapes the various different food environments, and these are the consequences of the production chain. So food environments are always a combination of the dynamics of the food system and environment, the aspects of the physical environment, the characteristics of people, both individually, but also collective persons that shape the collective, and the political, social, economic, and cultural context. In relation to what I mentioned, the dynamics of the food change, what am I talking about? What do I mean by that? These are especially the entry points for foods in what we consider the food environments. I'm talking about the scenarios. The foods are or are not made available and purchased. So I'm talking about the supply chain. I'm talking about different opportunities that people have to contact foods, contact the producers, the farmers, to purchase or not purchase the food in a meal. These are what we call the entry points for foods. And the aspect of the food chain is the food itself, beverages or meals, which foods are entering these entry points, how they enter, with what characteristics they have, who produced them, how they produced them, who prepared them, how they prepared them, who prepared them, how. Are they accessible? Are they desirable, or they're not desirable for people? Are they consistent with that environment, with that cultural reference in that community of those people? So these are the dynamic differences in the food chain, which comprise the relationship in the production chain with the food environment. Therefore, the food environments are not exclusively in any way, shape, or form, but are to a certain extent, they are affected by these different actors in the processes in the production chain. So it's indispensable when we consider changes in food environments towards sustainability, health, we need to think of actions that impact these actors and processes. So all of our process, both in Brazil and elsewhere in the world, is to impact and intervene in these processes and actors through regulatory measures, whether publicity, food product composition, the issue of labeling, the cost and price composition of the products. Other aspects which consist the interaction between these different elements which comprise food environments. They have involved the physical environment, how you reach a place where I can purchase food, what kind of infrastructure is available, what kind of establishments are available. Of course, there are the characteristics of individuals, the issue of income, schooling, attitudes, cultural values, and skills in the political, social, economic, and cultural context, which are not elements separate, but they're cross-cutting elements, cross-cutting all of these elements that I cited before. I want to quickly mention, and here I see that I have 5 minutes left. I wanted to briefly mention this document here, which I like quite well. It's just from this group that Cecilia participates in and which has produced extremely important documents over the course of its history. This is a document, recent document, where they do a
This document presents the situation of the future in 2045, talking about an extreme. If we still play the game as we're playing the game now from the hegemony perspective, and if food systems keep on going through the same track of hegemony, they propose this exercise. If experiences, proposals of social movements and civil society as a whole could eventually gain momentum and introduce a new paradigm in the food system, where would we be at? It is an interesting document by IPS Food, and there are many interesting aspects I would like to share with you today. They start analyzing the general perspective and outlook of the consequences of the growing concentration process in the agro-food system and food systems as a whole. And considering production and supply chains, they warn what is a fact. It's not a future risk, which is a deep concentration, a very deep concentration and vertical alignment of retail processes, not only in production practices, but in the knowledge, in the financing, in the different processes involved that make food available for all of us. So this increases power and influence of large corporations. We're not only talking about food processing corporations, but other concentrations. We're talking about one single conglomerate, and this is what makes them be the owners of the rules of the game. And this is the worst situation from all perspective, from the perspective of national sovereignty, country and communities' poverty, the capacity of eating what you decide to eat, and many other consequences. And furthermore, what they introduce is these promising scenarios of civil society's agendas, which are food systems that are based on diversity, agroecology, and human rights. And they present different opportunities. I want to focus on two. The first is to speed up supply chains within the framework of ethic and territorial consumption. We have a lot of experience during the pandemic. In the worst moments of the pandemic, we can replicate some experiences and reconfigure cities. Cities should be places in which we can foster healthy eating habits, to foster ethical and fair supply chains with a new ethics reference standard with production and consumption in a new relationship between farming and cities within fair and transparent relationships, and try to make more transparent and become more empowered on the real cost of what we're currently eating, not only the health cost, but the planetary present and future cost. And another aspect I would like to share with you today is the change in financial flows with fair taxing systems for large corporations and unhealthy products. And I'm talking about not only nutritional unhealthy products, but also what Susie mentioned that has to do with sustainability of what is produced, made available, and consumed. So I think that I will quickly mention, because I think that I am running a little late, we have to focus on the complexity, the multi-dimensional nature of food systems. There are interrelationship with food environments. But the thing is that when we research or when we think about public policies, we still cannot provide a deep enough outlook of the interaction of systems. And I'm a perfect example of this because while I was preparing my presentation, I wanted to make a more comprehensive presentation. We cannot focus on food, environment proposals, nutrition proposals as separate items, but we need to articulate the healthy food environment is the result of the production of healthy and sustainable food production, articulated with food supply strategies that are in line with the agenda of all of us that are struggling for food sovereignty in Brazil. And this is a process that is built historically, step by step. We're facing good and bad times with pros and cons, but there are endless examples of very concrete and practical examples. This is not an utopia. This is a possibility to talk about these topics from a more comprehensive approach, but we have a lot of very successful local experiences. So healthy food environments are foods, beverages, meals that contribute to a healthy food possibility that are available, affordable, low cost, are tasty, valued, and promoted, that foster sustainable, healthy foods. But remember that this is not a one direction process and it's not a both direction process. No, no, no. It's a multi-directional process. So this is the end of my presentation. And I hope we will have an interesting debate. Yes, we do have a couple of minutes to chat. There are a lot of participants that are
and food environments. And this means having to understand that food environments, they affect and are affected by what Cecilia showed us about the discussion on inequalities and equity, what it means, therefore, based on the production model, Suzi, with this model, it's going to be producing, it's based on inequalities, but it produces new inequalities, and this is going to impact our food environments. And Beta brought us an extremely important way what we have built in terms of proposals for building healthy food environments and sustainable food environments. I would like to share thoughts here to contribute to the roundtable. Afterwards, I'm going to move on to the questions, which has to do with the fact that with this debate on inequalities that Cecilia showed us, which Suzi and Beta are also going to discuss with us, that promoting food and healthy and sustainable food environments, what the degree to which it requires a deep transformation, both in the ethical and political reference, but also in our technical and scientific paradigm of foods related to nutrition and everything else, and the degree to which this requires us to confront the unequal and exploitative dynamics and expropriating dynamics, not only the food system, but also the capitalist system that we live in. So this is very evident when we share the data and show who the people are, who it's paradoxical, although we're at the base of a healthy and sustainable food system, which are the traditional peoples and communities, that the Black population, women, and we have several studies connected to the field of agroecology showing how women's work contributes to productive diversity and reclaiming and preserving agrobiodiversity. At the other end, we're going to see that these are the populations who are confronting food and nutritional insecurity when we compare the population issues. So this is an important point which I want to share for this debate and how we have this discussion of food environments, including the issue of racism and confronting racism and structural racism and institutional racism operating in this interaction. I'm going to begin with some questions now. I'm going to begin by the following. I think that we can have 2 rounds of questions. I'm going to share several questions. We're going to have another round, after which we're going to have another round. So the first question, Cecilia, Suzi, and Beta, you can also follow on the chat because this will facilitate. I'm going to read the question, but you can also pick up the questions in the chat box. For Cecilia from Leticia Cardoso, with your experience in a high-income country, could you comment on this inequality in power, the structural power compared to the scenario in Latin America, and especially in the promotion of healthy food? So this is one question, Cecilia, an important question for you. I'm going to 2 more questions for us to be able to have this round here. Mariana Zag is sharing a question here. What about the approach to sustainable diets in the context of food and nutritional insecurity? So in this sense, you can feel free to answer that question. Feel free. And Run Suarez Medeiros, he has another question, namely, how can we overcome the issue of the higher frequency of ultra-processed foods as processed and ultra-processed foods tied to their respective cost and convenience? As I understood, the question is addressed to Suzi. And let me see here if we have another question. These are the first questions. I think it will have this round of questions, after which we'll move on to another one. Do you want to begin, Cecilia? We'll keep the same order as before. I'm going to attempt here the question which was addressed to me concerned the situation of the promotion of healthy food in Canada. And of course, this is connected to the thing that we're talking about, the entire system. And what Suzi and Elisabetta said, they were important in bringing in these elements in the entire system as a whole, because what we can summarize perhaps the issue of we have a food environment, the hegemonic food system,
and it is a food system that is created by the system that are the ones that decide what we will eat, what is available, and what we want to do, and this is what Suzi mentioned earlier, is to change this, to say what it is we want to eat, how we want to eat, talking about the different aspects of the possibility of creating this system. And this document, the long food movement of IPES, is the intent of trying to do this. So which would be the system and what could be the system if we could really make this shift? So the question, being Canada a high income country and all of that that this entails, the context is exactly the same because we're talking about a global food system. And we're talking about the challenges with reference to this global food system, which are exactly the same. But on the other hand, there are different local cultures that give us the possibility to achieve certain things in one location or the other. One of the most interesting things that we can see here in Canada at the moment is the fact that Brazil and public policies in Brazil and civil society initiatives and research carried out in Brazil has an influence on thought, on food environments, and the promotion of healthy food globally. I am not well familiarized with the situation in other countries in Latin America, but I am very well informed about the situation in Brazil. And unfortunately, we're in a vacuum here in Brazil. I hope this will pass quickly. I hope this is just a moment, a collective nightmare, because Brazil, for many years, was the pioneer in the dissemination of a long food movement road or approach. Brazil was very much part of that because it is part of civil society participation in public policies. And here in Canada, we are influenced by Brazil. Beta was here in 2018, wasn't it, Beta? In a national conference that talked exactly about the development of a national policy, a national food policy following many things that Brazil had implemented. So our food guide that was approved in 2019 tries to follow the 2014 food guide from Brazil that Suzi mentioned some very interesting issues. They're not underscored, maybe the environmental components, but that Brazilian food guide is a revolution, is a global revolution. And in many other countries, we're still following these recommendations. Canada has a guide that is totally related to this. And in terms of public policies that we have here available in Brazil and civil society participation, the governance of what is needed to change and shift this system. So what I'm saying here is that we as a whole were facing a global system. There's nothing different in this sense. And in terms of what can be done, well, Suzi said there are things that are specifically Brazilian, and we have to deal with this from a local perspective. But how are these things made available? Which are the concentrations that we have in the food industry that affect the whole world, and the struggle that we're talking about? What are the contributions that research, how can research shed light on the public debate? Because we cannot leave this behind the scenes. It is very difficult to win the battle behind the scenes. We need to focus on the public debate, and researchers need to focus on these items and topics to really focus on necessary policies. So this is what I wanted to mention. In Canada, we are focusing on the possibility of trying to implement a committee, a national committee that is in the lines of CONSEA at national level, that for many, many years tried to focus on this topic, and we're trying to set up a national committee, a federal committee. And this is also a possibility to guide us within the necessary shifts. In spite of being a high-income country, and in spite of the fact that we have focused on many issues, there are equity issues. I talked about the Canadian indigenous peoples that represent the highest levels of diabetes in the world because their traditional eating habits was totally destroyed due to environmental issues. They can no longer consume some of their traditional products, and this has to do with the destruction of the environment. And we have a population of Black communities with very high indices of food insecurity of Black communities here in Canada. But really what we're doing right now is focusing on our local problems and see how we can work from there. Thank you so much for your comments. And unfortunately, Cecilia, due to time restrictions, we need to wrap up our Q&A session in spite of the fact that there are so many questions. But of course, those that have any comments, we can post them and we can send them to our speakers. So please, Suzi, Betta, our wrap-up comments. I will try to make comments that have to do with what has been mentioned here with a more comprehensive approach. I agree with Cecilia in the global considerations. This is a capitalistic process that is part of what we are dealing with here. But within this global and more comprehensive process, Brazil is currently undergoing a process, as Cecilia mentioned with such tender words mentioned. We are currently going through a process, a government process that is impossible. I mean, which are the words I'm looking for? It is very difficult. I mean, historians in the future will have a very difficult time to talk about this Brazilian moment. And I hope that this will change next year. I am very pessimistic. I know this is an utopia because I believe that we will take a very, very long time to rebuild what has been destroyed, the foundations that have been destroyed. I agree with Cecilia that we're on a very, very good track. And the CONSEA, which is the National Commission on Food and Nutritional Security, has been dismantled, and many things that were wonderful in the past have been dismantled. The topic of my research, which is food production, we don't have a wonderful context, but what I could say is that we are really focusing on some public policies that focused on agriculture. We had a more promising context in the past with so many initiatives that were left behind. And of course, my topic clearly exemplifies the fact that we're talking about quality, and we can only look for quality food if we can overcome the problem of food access. But this is obvious. We have seen the pictures in the news. Betta even showed the headlines here. It is horrible. People looking for garbage, bones for food. And of course, this is so makes me so emotional. I'm not optimistic. And of course, we're dealing with topics that are really very complex. And that's why I use the word utopia. We're going back to the debate of the lack of food access, the very basic. This has been a very, very terrible setback. And this is very complex. But, okay, we really need to find our strength. And well, on the other hand, I see that these issues, these ideas, I mean, how can we talk about sustainable diets in this context? I mean, we have to talk about consumption. We can use different terminologies, not the word consumer. But on the other hand, all of this will be leveraged by consumers. If we have hunger and lack of access, we need to talk about the terminology, economics terminology, because people need to understand these economic processes. We and apart from production, we need to understand these economic concepts. Yes, we understand very little, but when we talk about our debate, when we talk about sovereignty and nutritional and food sovereignty, some people, some counterparts that are in other niches or other areas of knowledge are very far from this debate. In academics, there are many Cartesian researchers. In nutrition, there are many Cartesian researchers that do not understand what we're talking about. So we have to talk with easier terms, using many, maybe not such specific terminology, because when we are talking about academics and when we talk about pesticides, there is a master's degree student, Teresa, that is researching a very interesting research when we're talking about the cleansing of pesticides from produce when you wash them. But we have to stop that. We have to stop that. People on TV say that we don't have to worry about pesticides because we can wash out pesticides from food. You can buy your berries, you can buy your strawberries and whatnot, because you can wash out pesticides. And this is a very serious problem. That's why I use the word utopia. Okay, yes, fantastic. We talk about industrialization, but when we talk about this relationship and these 90 guides that countries have, yes, theoretically, they should focus on food production, because this is the problem that we have. If we want to talk about food systems, if we want to really transform our diets and make sustainable diets available for all, we have to talk about that too. We cannot even keep on talking as these Cartesians say that we will try to change one produce for the other, for instance, with banana peels that have outrageous percentages of pesticides in the peel. So how can we talk about that? We cannot talk about that any longer. We have to really focus on these very timely topics and stop talking about erroneous concepts. Yes, there are toxic relationships amongst all of these interrelated issues. So I believe that these issues are really very problematic. I think that each one of us, I know that you would be fantastic and that you would be invited talking about the depth of our topics, because I do not believe that we will have a sustainable diet if we don't talk about food sovereignty. For me, sovereignty is the step one, is the baseline. If we do not provide any support for family farmers, we will never, ever improve food security in Brazil. That's the way things should be. And that's why those figures, I mean, we shouldn't talk about agribusiness and commodities and exports or imports. No, that's not the way. We need to talk about these issues and this approach when we talk about this cross-cutting sustainability. I mean, we need to talk about all of these implementers, whatever, everything that IPF food and what Cecilia mentioned, and we have to empower ourselves and include this in our reality. And today, can we do this? It's very complex with the incumbent government, without public policies, with the dismantling of all nutrition and food policies and all of the others that are included. This is very complex. So my utopias, okay, maybe I can start again 1 year and a half from now. I feel very pessimistic today. I understand, Susie, and everything that you're mentioning is relevant, and everything that you have mentioned about pesticides. And we are increasingly making all other prohibited pesticides be permitted here in Brazil, which is terrible. We have the case of Larissa Bombardi, which is a researcher that was forced to leave the country. Beta, please We have 10 more minutes for this interesting debate till 11 for a second round of Q&A. So if there are more questions, we will have 10 more minutes, but in fact, we will wrap up at 11.
Elisabetta has the floor now. Okay, I believe that if we're on this planet now at this time, especially in Brazil, we are urged to have active hope with solidarity and mobilization. Otherwise, it's hopeless. I'm just going to address this question quickly. I'm going to try to be brief on the issue of sustainable food and nutrition and diet and the issue of food security. I don't know if there's a single answer. It depends on where you are. And in this sense, what is the role that you play and what are the relations that you establish in the sense of what kind of role you play at this time. I think that if, for example, if you're a healthcare professional who's in the territory, you are in a situation, for example, of a community with food insecurity. I think that there are some processes and some partnerships that you can mobilize in the sense of building a bridge with farmers, bridges to other community resources, which you can to deal with that situation from the point of view of the emergency. If you in the academia, you have a role there, which is training the professionals that you have contact with and research. If you at the management or administrative level, you have the role of defense and reclaiming the political context where your management or administrative role is played, the degree to which you're able to deal with the processes, if you're a legislator, if you're a person who in a situation of greater command or control, it's an adverse situation. It goes without saying, of course, the situation is adverse in Brazil. So the situation that exists and what you project and what we need to project into the future requires of us, wherever we are, an attitude, a proactive stance or attitude. I'm not saying that individual proactive activity solves everything, but what I do say is that if you don't have a proactive attitude wherever you are, the world is not going to change. I'm sorry, but I'm going to wait for the second round. Now, okay, thank you very much, Beta. I want to invite people who are attending, if you haven't read yet the sentence by the popular court against hunger. It's an important instrument and rich one, which Brazilian civil society has built here. I'm going to turn the floor over to the next questions, move on to the next question. Even the message that I have not read, they're here in the chat box. So whoever wrote them, the praise and everything in the commentary, the speakers are reading them here in the chat box, the messages that you've sent in. So a question from our, thank you very much, the giving fundamental issues raised by the speakers. I would like to hear their opinion concerning food systems and what are the challenges. Now, I'm going to do the following. There are going to be three questions. I'm going to address this question to Elisabetta and ask her to talk a little bit about this issue of corporate capture, what we can do and what we can seek in this information for the second question. It's from Veruska. Hello, Veruska. Nice to see you. Nice to see you here with us. I would like to hear you about what paths, considering the difficult times we have, what paths do we have to conquer healthy and sustainable and equity promoting food environments? I know that you're addressing the question to all three. I'm going to propose that if Cecilia can answer that question, since you brought the discussion of equity and inequality. The third question, which is by Ingrid, I can see here that the third question by Ingrid Garcia, which is what are the challenges in the methodological fields for progress in citizen science and research as a public good? The questions are quite dense. Of course, you're going to be able to answer them very quickly and highlighting issues that will be discussed in greater depth at another stage. The debate generates another debate, and it's like a snowball where we build citizen science in this fashion. I'm going to begin with Cecilia. I thought it was going to be the opposite order, but that's fine. I'm ready. Would you like us to change the order? It's fine, okay? I'm used to these things. So there's the issue of the paths. I believe that we have an idea of the paths. We have a basic idea of the paths. As I said, I believe that especially for you who are working in Brazil, we were already on the path. Not ideally, as Cecilia said, the issue of agroecology, for example, there's a discussion on agroecology. There's still a discussion, a strong and interesting discussion on agroecology. And again, Brazil as a pioneer in terms of this discussion on agroecology, I believe that the public policies which were being developed before this hiatus, that's a hiatus, it will pass. I agree with Elisabetta. Actually, years after I decided to have children, I don't have the right to despair. I'm going to be a grandmother soon. You have to think, okay, it's not an issue of a utopia. Of course, I was a friend of Betinho, Herbert de Souza, who was exiled in Canada, and he used to talk about the issue of utopia. He said, okay, I want to be utopian with my feet firmly planted on the ground, in the ground, but knowing where we are. And so these things are necessary to have hope. So addressing the question on this research as a public good, which was also the second question. What I think both paths, many of us here are academics, we work in this area. There are examples, successful examples exist, and that's what we have to hold on to. So the issue of taxes on sugary beverages, for example, it is a discussion which, moving forward, there are a lot of places that already have taxes on sugary beverages. The idea is for us not to despair because of the current moment. Of course, the current moment requires us to join forces wherever we can, but to always think that this is a hiatus and that in fact things fluctuate up and down, but always thinking in the long term of the utopia, where we want to reach, to take these examples which we have had in the past, examples which are happening even today, and attempt to build this. Thank you very much, Cecilia. I'm going to turn the floor over to Suzi. Suzi, just 2 minutes. I know that the time is very short, and we'll have 2 minutes for beta, and then we'll adjourn, okay? My microphone is turned off. Okay, picking up on the issue of utopia, I agree with the issue of what Eduardo, utopias may help us to forward, but the political relationship, I think, is, I always talk about the people to understand this as well. Cecilia, since you are working in Canada, we see a lot of people either to understand the political moment in Brazil. I think that you're able to observe this from afar. There are also people who apparently aren't able to reflect on the current moment. I talk a lot about, in this sense, of course, I see light at the end of the tunnel. I have this hope, but I think some people fail to realize this. Of course, as Elisabetta said, we have to gather strength, join forces for things to improve. But people also have to be aware of what we're experiencing and to realize the reality. Of course, we know that, in fact, we have to continue pursuing our issues. And with regard to the questions that are raised, I think the issue of research is essential. And I participate in a movement here in Brazil, which is the global movement of citizens research. So I think that this is extremely important, especially in these field that I experience here, working more with systems. We have a lot of problem with these issues. We can see at CT and BO, We see a lot of this. I commented on several things, the kind of studies we had to be focused on this. The National Commission on Bioethics, for us to publish in the journals they are funded, we need to have a financial scope. So all of these are things that have to be discussed. So we are experiencing a process, for example, in the National Research Council, the CNPq, the Brazilian Federal Agency for the Improvement and Evaluation of Graduate Studies, CAPES, doing research in an area in food and nutritional security, food environments, and the food systems are themes that are more difficult for us to be able to get funding for. And we need to have this public funding. So increasingly, I believe that this relationship in discussing citizen research, especially in our the academia, it's extremely important, and in corporations as well, and all of these issues. So this is the message. I believe that it is great for us to focus on our own places and discuss this. It's very complicated. These two approaches, doing research and how we can share and disseminate the research through the journals, etc. Thank you very much, Suzi. I'm going to turn the floor over to Elisabetta. Cecilia and Suzi have already answered and make their final remarks. I'm going to turn the floor over to Elisabetta for her to adjourn. So adjourn, because after this is another activity on the program. It's not going to be possible to talk about this summit because we already gone beyond our time limit. I had asked the organization of the event to put in the chat box for the participants 2 links. One link is the web page for the Mechanism of Civil Society, which has the history, not only the documents, but also the position by global civil society concerning the summit and the activities, etc., the analyses that were conducted. There's an extremely interesting analysis with researchers from civil society to analyze the summit. And there's a document which shows the advocacy by transnational corporations in the process in the summit. It's an extremely important document and well done in the documents of what you called corporate capture. So also there is a popular conference on food and nutritional security and sovereignty. We did a debate on this, produced a document, and I believe that for people who are interested with regard to what the summit was and what the results of the summit will be in intensification of all of this, with Cecilia, Suzi, and myself, have attempted to present it here concerning the issue of food systems and environments. I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm certain that the rest of the program is going to be fascinating and provocative and interesting. I think that there's a long road ahead of us, not only for this agenda, but the issue, for example, that Suzi raised concerning research and knowledge, which is, for example, one of the areas of intense dispute in food systems concerning the issue of knowledge and science. Thank you very much indeed, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to go into greater detail, but we all have other opportunities, of course. So thank you very much, but we have these documents that you uploaded here will contribute to whoever wants to go into the issue deeper and add to this dialogue. I want to thank Cecilia, Suzi, and Elisabetta, who have honored us with their presence. And I want to thank also the coordinators of the seminar, Paulo Cesar Castro, who issued the invitation, Paula and Larissa, who are here, Paula Orta, and who are here supporting the organizing committee, and Mateus, who is giving us the logistics support on the issue with the technology. So I want to thank everyone, and the schedule will continue. We got it moved into the break a little bit, but they're good questions which contribute here to this rich debate.